The crate of military-grade weapons was being unloaded from the delivery truck at 6:47 a.m., just as Mike Thompson was walking his golden retriever past the warehouse on Elm Street. To the gun smugglers, he looked like just another old man getting his morning exercise, harmless, invisible, and completely unaware of their illegal operation. What they didn't know was that the elderly dog walker observing their every move had spent 23 years as an ATF specialist, and he was already calculating how to bring down their entire trafficking network. Mike had been walking the same route through the Riverside Heights neighborhood for 8 years, ever since he had moved to this quiet suburban community following his retirement from federal law enforcement. At 63 years old, with silver hair, a slightly stooped posture, and the slow, careful gait of someone whose knees had seen better days, he appeared to be exactly what his neighbors assumed he was: a lonely widower trying to fill his empty days with simple routines and the companionship of his faithful dog. Charlie, his 4-year-old golden retriever, had become Mike's constant companion and the perfect cover for his continued surveillance activities. To everyone in the neighborhood, Mike was simply the nice old man who walked his dog twice a day, always ready with a friendly wave and a willingness to chat about the weather, local sports, or whatever neighborhood gossip was currently circulating among the residents of their tree-lined streets. Welcome to those who left a trace, where ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets. Before we dive into this incredible story of a retired federal agent whose morning dog walks would uncover the largest illegal firearms trafficking operation in state history, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community of over 700,000 subscribers who love these powerful stories that prove anyone can leave a lasting trace. What none of Mike's neighbors knew was that Michael Joseph Thompson had spent 23 years as a special agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, specializing in the investigation and prosecution of illegal firearms trafficking operations throughout the southeastern United States. His career had been distinguished by an extraordinary success rate in identifying, infiltrating, and dismantling some of the most sophisticated gun smuggling networks in the country. Mike's expertise had been built through decades of undercover operations, surveillance techniques, and intelligence-gathering methods that had made him one of the ATF's most effective agents. He had worked cases involving international arms dealers, domestic terrorist organizations, and criminal enterprises that move hundreds of millions of dollars worth of illegal weapons across state and national borders. His specialty had been what the ATF called pattern recognition and network analysis, the ability to identify seemingly unrelated activities and connections that revealed the structure and operations of complex criminal organizations. Mike could observe a neighborhood for weeks, catalog apparently innocent activities and relationships, and gradually build a comprehensive understanding of how illegal operations were being conducted right under the noses of local law enforcement and unsuspecting civilians. Throughout his federal career, Mike had developed an almost supernatural ability to blend into any environment and observe criminal activity without being detected. He could assume the identity of a construction worker, a delivery driver, a small business owner, or any other civilian role that will allow him to monitor suspects and gather intelligence without arousing suspicion. His undercover work had taken him from the gun shows of rural Georgia to the urban streets of Atlanta, from the docks of Miami to the border towns of Texas. He had posed as a gun collector, a security consultant, a sporting goods dealer, and dozens of other personas that allowed him to infiltrate criminal networks and gather the evidence needed to bring down entire trafficking organizations. But the psychological toll of decades spent in the criminal underworld had been enormous. Mike had been forced to witness countless acts of violence, to build relationships with dangerous people who would kill him without hesitation if his true identity were discovered, and to maintain false personas for months or years at a time while gathering evidence against individuals who often became something resembling friends during his extended undercover operations. The breaking point had come during a 3-year investigation of a multi-state firearms trafficking network that was supplying weapons to various criminal organizations throughout the Southeast. Mike had spent those years posing as a corrupt gun dealer, building trust with the network's leadership, and documenting their operations in meticulous detail. The investigation had been successful beyond all expectations, resulting in the arrest and conviction of 47 individuals and the seizure of over 3,000 illegal weapons. But the personal cost had been devastating. Mike's marriage had ended during the investigation. His relationship with his adult children had been severely damaged by years of absence and deception, and his psychological health had been compromised by the constant stress of living a lie while surrounded by violence and criminality. Following the conclusion of that final case, Mike had submitted his retirement papers and moved to Riverside Heights, seeking the peace and anonymity that had been impossible during his federal career. He had chosen a quiet suburban neighborhood specifically because it seemed to represent everything that his professional life had lacked: stability, predictability, and the kind of ordinary community relationships that his undercover work had made impossible. The purchase of Charlie had been part of Mike's deliberate strategy to establish a new civilian identity that would allow him to integrate into his new community while maintaining the observational skills that had become second nature during his law enforcement career. A man walking a dog was invisible in suburban neighborhoods, able to move freely through residential areas while engaging in casual conversations with neighbors that provided valuable intelligence about local activities and relationships. Mike's daily walks with Charlie had initially been simply therapeutic, a way to establish routine, get exercise, and gradually build the social connections that would help him transition from his isolated professional life to meaningful civilian relationships. But his training and instincts made it impossible for him to simply walk through his neighborhood without observing, analyzing, and cataloging everything he saw. Within his first month in Riverside Heights, Mike had developed detailed profiles of every household on his walking route. He knew which residents worked which shifts, who had visitors at unusual hours, which homes showed signs of unusual wealth or activity, and which residents exhibited behavior patterns that might indicate involvement in illegal activities. The surveillance had been purely automatic at first, a professional habit that Mike couldn't simply turn off after decades of investigative work. But gradually, he had begun to notice patterns and activities that suggested his quiet suburban neighborhood might not be as innocent as appeared on the surface. The first anomaly Mike had identified was the unusual amount of commercial traffic in a residential area that should have been primarily occupied by commuters and families. Delivery trucks, service vehicles, and unfamiliar cars were constantly moving through streets where such activities should be minimal and predictable. The second red flag had been the behavior patterns of several residents who appeared to be conducting business operations from their homes without the appropriate commercial zoning or business licenses. These individuals received frequent visitors at unusual hours, maintained irregular schedules that didn't correspond to normal employment patterns, and displayed signs of income that seemed inconsistent with their stated occupations. Most concerning had been Mike's observation of what appeared to be coordinated activities among several households that had no obvious legitimate connection. Residents who claimed not to know each other were clearly communicating and coordinating their schedules and activities in ways that suggested involvement in shared business operations that they were keeping hidden from their neighbors and local authorities. Over his first year in the neighborhood, Mike had documented these patterns and activities in detailed surveillance logs that he maintained purely out of professional habit. He had no intention of returning to law enforcement work, but his training made it impossible for him to ignore evidence of potential criminal activity in his own community. The situation had escalated when Mike began observing activities that strongly suggested illegal firearms trafficking. Individuals with known connections to criminal organizations were making regular visits to several homes in the neighborhood. Packages and containers were being transferred between vehicles and residences under circumstances that suggested efforts to avoid detection. Most significantly, Mike had observed several residents handling and examining what appeared to be military-style weapons in locations where such activities should not have been occurring. Mike's ATF experience had taught him to recognize the operational patterns of illegal firearms trafficking networks. The activities he was observing in Riverside Heights matched those patterns in disturbing detail. The neighborhood appeared to be serving as a distribution hub for a sophisticated gun smuggling operation that was using the cover of suburban respectability to avoid detection by law enforcement. The realization that his peaceful retirement community was actually the center of a major criminal enterprise had presented Mike with a difficult moral dilemma. His federal career was over. He had no official authority to investigate criminal activity, and his primary goal was to maintain the quiet civilian life he had worked so hard to establish. But his conscience and his professional expertise made it impossible for him to ignore evidence that dangerous weapons were being distributed through his neighborhood to criminal organizations that would use them to commit violent crimes throughout the region. Mike knew that his unique background and position gave him capabilities that local law enforcement agencies lacked, and that his intervention might be the only way to prevent the trafficking network from continuing to operate. Mike's solution had been to gradually expand his surveillance activities while maintaining his cover as a harmless retiree walking his dog. He began varying his routes and schedules to observe different aspects of the suspected trafficking operation. He started engaging in more extensive conversations with neighbors to gather intelligence about their activities and associations. Most importantly, he began documenting evidence that could be used to build a comprehensive case against the criminal network. The surveillance work had been conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized Mike's federal career. He used his daily dog walks to photograph license plates, document visitor patterns, and observe the transfer of packages and materials between suspected trafficking locations. He engaged neighbors in casual conversations that revealed details about their work schedules, travel patterns, and business relationships. Charlie had been the perfect partner for these surveillance operations. The dog's presence provided natural cover for Mike's activities, giving him legitimate reasons to pause in specific locations, approach certain properties, and engage in extended conversations with residents who might otherwise have been suspicious of an elderly man asking detailed questions about their activities. Over a period of 18 months, Mike had built a comprehensive intelligence file on the firearms trafficking network operating in Riverside Heights. His investigation had revealed a sophisticated operation that was using residential properties as storage and distribution points for illegal weapons being moved from suppliers in other states to criminal organizations throughout the region. The network's leadership had been remarkably clever in their operational security. They had chosen Riverside Heights specifically because it was a stable, middle-class community where unusual activity would be less likely to attract law enforcement attention. They had recruited residents who appeared to be legitimate homeowners and business people, providing them with cover stories and financial incentives to participate in the trafficking operation. Most importantly, the network had implemented sophisticated counter-surveillance measures designed to detect law enforcement interest in their activities. They rotated their operations between different locations, used coded communications to coordinate their activities, and maintained strict operational security that would have made them difficult for conventional police investigations to penetrate. But Mike's unique position as a neighborhood resident with decades of federal law enforcement experience had allowed him to observe and analyze their operations from a perspective that would have been impossible for official investigators. His daily presence in the neighborhood, his established relationships with local residents, and his ability to conduct long-term surveillance without arousing suspicion had given him access to intelligence that conventional law enforcement methods could not have obtained. The breakthrough in Mike's investigation had come when he observed the early morning delivery at the warehouse on Elm Street. The building, which was supposed to be used for legitimate commercial storage, was actually serving as a central distribution point for military-grade weapons that were being moved through the trafficking network to criminal organizations throughout the Southeast. Mike's ATF experience had taught him to recognize the specific types of weapons and equipment that were typically involved in high-level trafficking operations. The crates being unloaded from the delivery truck contained the kinds of military-style assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, and specialized ammunition that were commonly sought by criminal organizations planning major violent crimes. More importantly, Mike had recognized several of the individuals involved in the delivery operation as suspects from previous federal investigations. Their presence in Riverside Heights confirmed that the local trafficking network was connected to much larger criminal organizations that were operating across multiple states and possibly international borders. The scale and sophistication of the operation Mike had discovered far exceeded anything that local law enforcement agencies would have the resources or expertise to handle effectively. The investigation would require federal involvement, specialized surveillance capabilities, and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies at the state and federal level. Mike's challenge was finding a way to report his findings to appropriate authorities without revealing his own background or compromising the surveillance position he had established in the neighborhood. His cover as a retired civilian was essential to his ability to continue gathering intelligence, but also limited his options for communicating with law enforcement agencies that would need to take action against the trafficking network. The solution had been to develop an anonymous intelligence package that provided federal authorities with detailed information about the trafficking operation while concealing Mike's identity and methods. Using secure communication techniques learned during his ATF career, Mike had compiled comprehensive surveillance data, photographic evidence, and intelligent analysis that clearly documented the scope and structure of the criminal network. The intelligence package Mike provided to federal authorities contained detailed profiles of the trafficking network's leadership, documentation of their operational methods, evidence of their connections to other criminal organizations, and specific information about the locations and timing of their weapons storage and distribution activities. The package represented nearly 2 years of professional-level surveillance and intelligence gathering that would have required a team of federal agents months or years to develop through conventional investigative methods. Mike's intelligence proved to be extraordinarily accurate and valuable to federal investigators. The ATF task force that was assembled to investigate the Riverside Heights trafficking network was able to use Mike's information to quickly identify and monitor the network's operations, build cases against its leadership, and coordinate with other federal agencies to investigate the network's connections to broader criminal enterprises. The federal investigation that followed Mike's anonymous tip resulted in one of the largest firearms trafficking prosecutions in the region's history. Over a period of 6 months, federal agents conducted a comprehensive operation that resulted in the arrest of 37 individuals, the seizure of over 1,500 illegal weapons, and the dismantling of a trafficking network that had been operating across 7 states. The investigation revealed that the Riverside Heights operation had been just one component of a much larger criminal enterprise that was responsible for moving thousands of illegal weapons from manufacturers and importers to criminal organizations throughout the southeastern United States. The network's annual revenue was estimated at over $40 million, and their weapons had been linked to hundreds of violent crimes, including robberies, assaults, and homicides in cities across the region. But Mike's contribution to the investigation went far beyond the initial intelligence that had triggered federal involvement. Throughout the months-long federal operation, Mike had continued providing anonymous updates and analysis that helped investigators adapt their tactics, anticipate the network's responses to law enforcement pressure, and identify new targets and opportunities for evidence gathering. Mike's ongoing intelligence support had been crucial to the investigation's success. His position as a neighborhood resident allowed him to observe changes in the network's operations and security measures that federal agents conducting external surveillance might have missed. His analysis helped investigators understand the network's decision-making processes and predict their likely responses to various investigative pressures. Most importantly, Mike's intelligence had helped federal agents avoid operational mistakes that could have compromised the investigation or allowed key suspects to escape prosecution. His warnings about the network's counter-surveillance capabilities had prevented several federal surveillance operations from being detected, and his analysis of the suspects' behavior patterns had helped investigators time their arrests and searches to maximize evidence seizure and minimize the risk of violent confrontations. The successful conclusion of the federal investigation had eliminated a major source of illegal weapons in the southeastern United States and disrupted criminal networks that had been responsible for significant levels of violent crime throughout the region. The prosecution of the trafficking network's leadership had resulted in sentences totaling over 400 years in federal prison, effectively destroying the organization's ability to continue its operations. But Mike's work had also created lasting changes in federal law enforcement approaches to firearms trafficking investigations. The intelligence methods he had developed during his anonymous collaboration with federal investigators were incorporated into ATF training programs and operational guidelines for investigating trafficking networks in suburban and residential environments. Mike's success in penetrating the Riverside Heights trafficking network while maintaining a civilian cover had demonstrated the potential value of using retired law enforcement personnel as intelligence assets in communities where conventional surveillance methods would be ineffective or too conspicuous. His methods became models for similar operations in other regions where federal agencies suspected that residential areas were being used to support criminal activities. The training materials that federal agencies developed based on Mike's work emphasize the importance of long-term observation, pattern recognition, and the development of community relationships that could provide ongoing intelligence about suspicious activities. His techniques for gathering intelligence through casual social interactions became standard components of undercover training programs for federal agents working in suburban and rural environments. Mike's influence on federal law enforcement extended beyond the specific techniques he had developed during his investigation. His success had demonstrated the continued value of experienced investigators even after their official retirement, leading to the development of formal programs that utilized retired federal agents as consultants and intelligence assets for complex investigations. The Retired Agent Intelligence Network, established partly in response to the success of Mike's work, became a valuable resource for federal agencies investigating cases that required specialized expertise or access to communities where active agents would have difficulty establishing effective surveillance positions. The program provided structure and support for retired investigators who wanted to continue contributing to law enforcement efforts while maintaining their civilian status and community relationships. 5 years after the Riverside Heights investigation, Mike's methods and techniques have been adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the country. His approach to community-based intelligence gathering was being taught in police academies and federal training centers as a model for effective surveillance and investigation in residential environments. The impact of Mike's work extended beyond law enforcement training and techniques to broader community safety and crime prevention efforts. The elimination of the Riverside Heights trafficking network had significantly reduced the availability of illegal weapons in the region, contributing to measurable decreases in armed robberies, gang violence, and other crimes that depended on access to untraceable firearms. Local law enforcement agencies reported substantial improvements in public safety following the federal investigation, with violent crime rates in several cities dropping by more than 20% in a year following the trafficking network's dismantling. The reduction in illegal weapons availability had disrupted numerous criminal organizations and forced many violent criminals to alter their methods or cease their activities entirely. But perhaps Mike's most significant contribution was a demonstration that effective law enforcement could be conducted by individuals working within their own communities, using their professional expertise to identify and address criminal activities that might otherwise go undetected by official agencies with limited resources and jurisdictional constraints. Mike's success had inspired other retired law enforcement officers to become more actively involved in community safety efforts, leading to the development of informal networks of former investigators who provided intelligence and analysis to support official law enforcement efforts in their local communities. The Neighborhood Intelligence Initiative, which grew out of the interest generated by Mike's work, became a formal program that trained retired law enforcement personnel to recognize and report suspicious activities in their communities. The program provided structure and support for former investigators who wanted to contribute to community safety while maintaining their civilian status and avoiding the legal and professional complications associated with official law enforcement work. 10 years after Mike had first observed the suspicious delivery at the Elm Street warehouse, his influence on community-based law enforcement had expanded far beyond his original neighborhood. The techniques he had developed were being used by hundreds of retired investigators throughout the country, contributing to the identification and prosecution of criminal activities ranging from drug trafficking to organized fraud schemes. The success of community-based intelligence gathering had also influenced broader law enforcement strategies and resource allocation decisions. Federal and state agencies had begun placing greater emphasis on developing relationships with local communities and utilizing civilian resources to supplement their official investigative capabilities. Mike himself had continued living quietly in Riverside Heights, maintaining his cover as a retired civilian while providing ongoing intelligence support to federal agencies investigating criminal activities in other communities. His daily walks with Charlie continued to serve as cover for surveillance activities, but his primary focus had shifted from local investigations to training and mentoring other retired investigators who were interested in contributing to community safety efforts. The dog-walking retiree who had appeared to be simply filling his empty days with routine exercise had become one of the most influential figures in modern community policing and intelligence gathering. His methods have been studied, refined, and implemented by law enforcement agencies throughout the country, contributing to the successful investigation and prosecution of hundreds of criminal cases. Mike's personal satisfaction came not from recognition or official acknowledgement of his contributions. His work necessarily remained anonymous and unofficial, but from the knowledge that his expertise and dedication continued to protect communities and prevent violent crimes long after his official retirement from federal service. The trace that Mike had left was measured in the criminal networks that had been dismantled, the illegal weapons that had been seized, and the violent crimes that had been prevented through the intelligence and techniques he had developed. His legacy was written in the training materials used to educate new generations of investigators, in the community safety programs inspired by his example, and in the countless lives that were saved by the reduction in illegal weapons availability that his work had achieved. Charlie, now 11 years old and moving more slowly during their daily walks, remained Mike's faithful companion and operational partner. The dog had become something of a neighborhood celebrity, beloved by residents who had no idea of his role in one of the most successful law enforcement operations in regional history. The elderly man and his aging golden retriever continued their daily routes through Riverside Heights, maintaining the routine that had provided cover for Mike's investigation, and continued to serve as his means of monitoring community safety and security. To his neighbors, Mike remained simply a friendly retiree who loved his dog and always had time for a chat about the weather or local events. But beneath the surface of suburban normalcy, Mike Thompson remained what he had always been, a dedicated law enforcement professional whose expertise and commitment to justice continued to protect communities throughout the country. His daily walks with Charlie served as a reminder that the most effective protectors were often the ones who remained completely invisible, conducting their vital work without recognition or acknowledgement, while leaving traces that would continue safeguarding innocent people for generations to come. The crate of weapons that Mike had observed being delivered to the Elm Street warehouse had been the beginning of an investigation that transformed community-based law enforcement and demonstrated that heroes could be found in the most ordinary circumstances, walking their dogs through quiet neighborhoods while secretly working to keep their communities safe from the criminal organizations that threaten their peace and security.